Okay, so let's make some final tweaks to get our portrait ready to render. So I'll start by adding a bit of a backdrop behind our character to fill in that empty space. So let's bring in a plane and we'll rename it to backdrop, and we'll move that into place over in the viewport, and I might just switch off the bucket render as well. And our plane is pointing in the wrong direction, so over in the attributes, let's switch the orientation to -Z. Then we'll grab the move tool, and I just want to put this back behind our model. So we'll push that back a bit and maybe go to our 4 views. So we can scale this in and see how it's looking in the main camera view. And just scale it down a bit and move it up a tad so it fills that space up here in the camera view. And that looks fine in here. So let's add a new Redshift material for this and name that backdrop as well, and apply it to our plane. And we'll set this up over in the shader graph. It's currently just this flat gray color, but I want to give this a bit of texture. So I have an image off to the side, which I'll just drag into here, and I'll share a link to this in the resources PDF as well. It looks something like this. And we're going to plug this into the diffuse color, like so. And it's definitely looking a bit bright back there. I want it to be pretty subtle, so we'll need to darken this down. So between these two nodes, let's add a ramp node, and we'll pipe our texture into the input and the out color into the diffuse color. And if we set this to alt mode, this is going to allow us to remap our color range. So rather than having this white as the lightest color, let's bring this down to a dark gray. And straight away, I think that's looking much better. But I'm not too fond of that big glossy reflection of one of our lights up here. So let's grab that material and bring the reflection weight right down to 0. And just so we can speed up our render previews while we make these tweaks, let's hide our hair and flower layers from the render. And that should be a bit faster now. So the backdrop texture has a few nice looking paint splatters at the bottom here, which I wouldn't mind making a bit more visible as well. So let's go back here and just move that up a bit. And so we're not stretching it too much, I might just scale that down a bit as well. And that's looking a bit more interesting. So next, I might make her lips a little bit redder and glossier, and bring out the red in the jewel here, so I can make those a bit more of a focal point in our image. So let's head over to the character materials and grab the lips, and back in the shader graph, here's the skin shader we set up earlier, which we'll keep. We just want to redden up the lips by increasing the saturation of our diffuse map here. So let's add a color correct node and plug that into here. And the out color will replace the shallow color, which is the outer layer of skin in the skin material. And now if we just isolate those lips, they've got a slight red tint to them at the moment. But if we bring the saturation scale up here ever so slightly, I think they stand out a bit more now. So let's also make them a bit more glossy over in the skin material. Under reflections, let's just increase these glossiness values. And that looks good. So let's move the render region over the diamond, and we'll make that a bit redder as well to match those lips. So over to jewelry, we'll grab that specular material, and we originally tinted it here in the transmission color. So let's do the same. And we'll just bring this down into a more intense red. Maybe not that far, just so it's matching a bit closer to the shade of the lips. And I think that's fine. So another thing I like to do with portraits is add a little glint to the eyes. So let's do that right here in Redshift by adding another area light. And we'll head back over to our perspective view. And obviously, if we move this around, it's going to affect our whole scene here, which doesn't look so great. But I actually only want this to be reflected in the eyes and not to emit any light onto our character. So to do that, we'll turn off the render for a second. And we need to figure out a way to isolate just the eyes. And DAZ models tend to have an extra layer of geometry around the eyeballs, which is currently what our eye moisture material is applied to, which gives them that glossy look. So in order to restrict our eye light to only that geometry, we'll need to separate that part from our model. So let's do that. We'll grab our character and switch over to polygon mode. And in order to select the full geometry surface around the eyes, we'll go to Select and Fill Selection. And then it's just as easy as clicking here and holding Shift and clicking the other one to select the outer layer of both eyes. And now we need to split these off as a separate object. So we'll right click and do a split. And if we look up here and hide the character, you can see we now have these separated from the character mesh. So let's rename this to eyes so we don't get confused. But if we show the character again, splitting doesn't actually remove the geometry from the original. And you can see those faces are still there and selected on here. But because we've made a copy and we don't want two sets of these intersecting, we can just delete those faces now. And now we just have those two separate parts. And just to keep things tidy, our eye covers are fairly simple. So we can also delete all of these extra tags now. And we only need to have that eye moisture material on there. And now we can grab the eye light. And to have this only affect that separate eye mesh, we can go over to Project and set the mode to Include and just drag those eyes into here. And now if we check this out, everything goes back to normal except our eyes, which are now showing our eye lights in the reflection. And we'll position our eye light to give us a slight glint in the corner of the eyes. So we'll use the same trick we did earlier by looking through the light, which should make positioning this a bit easier. And we just want to point this toward the eyes and rotate it till we're happy with the reflection, which we'll keep an eye on over here. And the reflection is actually quite large at the moment, because if we take a look at the dimensions of our light, that's also quite large. But if we shrink this down to maybe 10 centimeters, we can make that reflection much smaller. And we definitely want to keep this effect nice and subtle as well, just enough to bring a bit of life into the eyes. And I also find switching the light shape to disk can round those reflections out and look a bit nicer as well. And you could also adjust the intensity and exposure of the light as well to make those more or less visible. But I think I'm pretty happy with this now. So let's turn off the render region again. And one last thing I want to do before we render this is just to darken this area down a bit more so it's not so distracting. So back in the default camera, if we grab our flag again, we'll move this up ever so slightly to cut more of that light away from here. So we really focus on just this area here. And that's looking better now. So let's finish this by re-enabling all the layers. And we'll do one more bucket render. And while that's rendering away, let's go and pop open our post effects. And we can start adding the finishing touches to our image as it's rendering. So let's enable photographic exposure, which instantly brightens things up. But let's go in here and play with the f-stop to get the right exposure. And about there might work. And we might also enable the color controls and add a bit of contrast as well. And what else do we have here? Maybe a little bit of vignetting as well. Again, to really draw the eye toward the center of the image. And we might also decrease the saturation ever so slightly. And maybe a tiny bit more contrast. And feel free to play around with these and see what kind of looks you can come up with. But I think we'll just add a little bit of bloom as well to give our character a nice soft glow. And again, we don't want to go too crazy with this. And about there is nice. And I think we can finally call our portrait done. So all we need to do now to finish this off is hit render. And that brings us to the end of the course. So now it's time for you to create your very own character and render off your next masterpiece here in Cinema 4D. So have fun, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you create.